I'm very sympathetic to the whole thing, but I wonder how you deal with the circularity, because the Fed is not a small player in this, and therefore your decisions will affect those probabilities themselves.
So Murray's question is that these probabilities are that when the monetary policymaker is taking actions, they'll be also be affecting these probabilities. I think that's a reasonable question to ask. In general, when we are doing modeling, we try to as best as we can to do this separation of what we're affecting and what we're not affecting. And so what we want to be looking at is the things we're not affecting and using this as a way to get a risk neutral probability densities for that as well. I mean, I have to say, as a general principle, there are definitely some actions we take where we think we're affecting this whole Q star, but as a general principle, we're thinking about more affecting risk-free rates as opposed to relatives of these things. And so, but your point is a well taken one. It's one you have to think through on a case-by-case basis.
Ajay, you was one question. Oh, okay. Any other questions? Well, I guess I'll ask one, which I know you emphasize the fact that judgment plays a role here. But in the situation leading up to the financial crisis, it became very clear that people were undervaluing, whether it was probabilities or costs, undervaluing the extreme left tail of the distribution. And as you said, the problem is it can be hard to get values for that from traded options or other securities. What does one do? Because in some sense, that's the most important concern policymakers have, is to avoid those extreme tail events or ameliorate them. In practice, what do you do about that?
Well, that's another great question, which is, I think that, it's not clear that there were systematically better predictions being offered by others besides folks in financial markets. If you could point to that, I think there would be a more powerful case.
Right.
I think this. One of my colleagues that used to be with me on the Federal Markets Committee, Don Cohn, a very wise man, always counseled the use of humility when we're thinking about policy making. I think of this as being an exercise in humility, where I'm subjugating my own assessments to what is out there in the marketplace, and I think there is a sense in which that's a positive. Now, do you want to be using imagination, maybe, in trying to think through what can take place beyond what's here? Yeah, I think that's right. But the people in the market also are pretty imaginative. So I think it's a challenging thing to think as policymakers we're going to be able to somehow systematically be able to outguess what's going on in the market in terms of what are going to be likely events or not in going forward. So one example of that right now. Well, I'll just leave it at that.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, if you apply your thinking to something like what's happening in Europe these days, you could have gotten very strong and wrong signals from the financial markets one way, where they have ignored for a long time certain developments, which you would have picked up if you looked at current account balances or credit developments. At the same time, now if you look at them, there's like these really strong reversals picking up, which would have led you to the other extreme. So, what do you think about that? Because the reliance on
I think embedded in what you're saying is a feeling that you know better than these people about what's the right way to forecast the future. And I'm not. I think that's a challenging stance. That's here. This is really about. But it's not. I'm getting myself caught up in the wrong way to say this. I mean, it's really not about the forecast of the future. It's really how much our resources worth in these states of the world going forward. The only way to know that is by looking at market prices. That is almost definition.
Jenya?
Yes, I have a question. And when you base your policy decision mainly on the asset prices, usually we know that before each crisis, each crisis is preceded by some asset bubbles. And then when you totally rely on your policy decision on asset prices, how do you disentangle the bubbles? And I mean, the bubbles before the crisis could bias your decision. Then it turned out to be exactly the wrong decision to deal with the crisis. Yeah.
Well, so the term. So the question was about the fact that before crises, there's usually an asset pricing bubble, and so it's clear. I guess the conclusion from that is that relying on asset prices would lead you to bad policy. Is that a fair summary? Yeah. So I mentioned in the course of my talk that language is certainly something people like to debate in academia. So I'll go back to my time as an academic, and I'll say bubble is not really a term that I like to throw around too loosely. I think what's important really is to be. Those are times when there's a lot of uncertainty on what future market values are going to be. That's, I think, really the right way. So if you see land values right now, in 2006, land values seem to be twice what they would be by historical standards. What does that mean going forward? What this is saying is you want to be relying on options. For example, one of the things we have here at the Minneapolis Fed is real estate investment trust indexes. We've got options on that. That'll tell you something about the relative value of resources across those various states of the world. I think it's a I think that it's a what you're looking for as a policymaker is the right way to make trade-offs across, when you're getting resources across different states of the world. That's what this is trying to point you towards. And the right way to be doing that is by looking at how people in the marketplace are valuing those resources, as opposed to making it up for yourself, I think, as a policymaker and saying, boy, I know land values are going to come down in 2 years, for sure. And so we should put a lot of weight on that instead. And I think in practice that isn't what policymakers do anyway. What you should be doing is being able to think through these uncertainties.
Question here?
How much do you think we need to worry about that some agents are constrained for their marginality in get net into asset prices?
So this is a great question. I hope you. So the question was, how much do we have to worry about some agents being constrained, and so that we have to worry about their market utilities not being reflected in asset prices? I hope you teach that question carefully when you teach net present value. Because that's the same question, right? I mean, if it shows up even more sharply there because interest rate, I would think about the relative valuation of resources in different dates as being even more affected by the kinds of constraints you're pointing to than relative valuation of resources across states. With that said, so what I try to emphasize here is a replacement cost approach of thinking about it, as opposed to trying to translate it directly into social welfare terms. If you adopt the kind of modeling and framework that you're thinking about, I think talking about a homogeneous loss, as I just did, you just can't do it. You're going to have to immediately be forced to thinking about a loss that's affecting different people in different ways. But the way I was modeling this is thinking about there being a homogeneous loss, and then what's the cost for the policymaker to go out and buy the resources necessary to replace that homogeneous loss.
Krista?
I liked your talk, but I was actually puzzled by the example that you gave. Because your example focused on dividend payments, and to me it seems strange to use either model to tell banks, oh, in this period you have to cut your dividends by this much. In this period you have to cut it by, maybe even more. So I'm just puzzled about the example that you gave.
Well, the question was, why did you use the example you used? It's an example that tends to be drawn from real life in the sense that in March the Fed was asked, as in its position as a regulator, had to approve capital planning decisions by large financial institutions, and formulated in the way one of the key questions that was being asked there was. Here's an adverse scenario. Are you going to have enough capital in that adverse scenario to deal with deal with that possibility. So I tried to draw that. That was what motivated that. Now it could be the connection between I abstract L's and A's and S's doesn't ring. It doesn't resonate enough on that dimension. I think should work on that. But that's what the connection is supposed to be.
Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, so I just sort of following up on the other question. So you could imagine doing it slightly differently without market price, at least in theory. You could say, I'm going to go off and I'm going to estimate what I think the real probability density function is, and then I'm going to take like a representative agent model or something against the proxy of marginal utility growth, and then adjust that accordingly, and that would be, in fact, another way where you wouldn't necessarily be just kind of making things up as you're going along, but actually basing it on some sort of modeling, and you would get something that potentially is different from market prices, and you couldn't put in, current account flows or whatever. So what is that something I'm very sympathetic to this, by the way, very. But I mean, you could.
Yeah, I guess I'm wearing my. First of all, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of trying to model asset prices. So I think that's very. But I guess so there's a very tricky question here about when you build a model of that's supposed to represent marginal valuations of resources across states of the world, which is what you're describing, and that model differs perhaps substantially from the market prices we see. Do we conclude that those guys are all idiots out there, we should be using this model instead, or do we perhaps, and I would we lean a little more heavily on it perhaps, conclude that maybe we have more work to do with the modeling dimension?
Well, or you conclude that if the difference is large, maybe it's more uncertainty or something like that.
I absolutely don't want to discourage modeling of that kind. I think it's incredibly important. I do think that what you strive for as a policymaker is ways to try to develop, and this is why people are drawn to statistical forecasts in some sense. You're trying to be drawn to things that are easily replicable, easily explainable, easily talked about, and but that's not an entirely great defense. I think it's more that I would talk about being a young assistant professor at Northwestern. What I was working on was how do you get these representative agent exposure utilities multiplied by probabilities to match up with asset prices? But from what I understand, that work is still afoot. And so I think that as long as that gulf exists, I think we should be putting some weight on what's out there in terms of prices.
I know Jenny had his hand up, but let me give you a chance with it.
Okay. Thanks. I guess the Fed has quite a lot of non-public information. So how do you think about that? Don't you have to release that non-public information about banks and so on? To get better asset prices.
So as a monetary policymaker, I think we have very good analysts on staff. Fantastic analysts, great model builders. So from the point of view of monetary policy, I think that it would be a mistake to exaggerate how much information we have. Certainly, as supervisors and regulators, you're right. We have access to a tremendous amount of information, and that's an ongoing debate about how much of that should be released. I think there's going to be you would gain something in terms of the informativeness of these prices. You're right, but there would be losses elsewhere, and you'd have to weigh those off.
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Jenny, I know you had your hand up.
My first question is about policy decisions before the crisis. So now I have a question about it's not a question, it's a comment that during the crisis, usually what we observe in New York is that during the crisis, a lot of no arbitrage relationships broke down in the market. And then, so I noticed for the risk neutral probability to exist, the necessary conditions, no arbitrage. So that's a challenge we will face when we try to rely on the
Yeah, I think your comment ties into Murray's question at the beginning. So Murray couched his question at the beginning in terms of monetary policy affecting state prices. So for those who couldn't hear, the question was about during the financial crisis, it seemed like a lot of arbitrage relationships broke down. And what you need to justify the existence of a risk neutral probability density like this is an absence of arbitrage. And so if those are breaking down, how do you justify that? I think the Fed's interventions during the financial market crisis, during 2008, 2009, were interventions spurred by the idea that you're trying to influence these prices in a big way. And so I think it would be very challenging to use this framework for what's going on in a financial market crisis. What you're trying to do, in some sense, is use your role as a big player to, as Murray talked about, as a big player to get prices back to what they normally are. And I think the Fed was very successful in that, but I don't think you could have done that using you can't use market prices as your only measure at that point. And one way to make it less abstract, if you start to see a bunch of spreads developing, you start to see obvious breakdowns of arbitrage relationship, I think you have to start to walk away from this kind of. That's when asset prices you have to really wonder about their performance.
Okay, two last questions. First you,
Hey,
and then
two already.
Time inconsistency.
What do you do in a model or in a setup with multiple equilibria? Because in that case, risk-neutral densities is maybe not the best thing to look at, and maybe the task of the Fed is exactly to make the market settle on one, probably the better ones of these.
Yeah, I think for most of the work we do, that's not a relevant concern. But I think it's exactly in the, I always forget to repeat the question. The question was about multiple equilibria. And is this going to be the right way to be thinking about things when you have a framework with multiple equilibria? And the answer is no, it won't be. But I think most of the work we do is not really about moving across equilibrium. It's really about, the way I think about it at least, is we're within one equilibrium and trying to influence the economy in an appropriate way given that equilibrium. The counter to it is when you're in a liquidity panic situation, the kind we were in late 2008, 2009, that's exactly, the way I interpret that is you are trying to shift equilibrium. And that's going to be very, and I don't, as I indicated earlier, I don't think this would be an appropriate tool in that context. But the hope is that's not something we have to do all the time. So this is more for standard operating procedure. I warm out.
Okay. Well, thank you again.